The strongest sage with the weakest crest is a Mary Sue power fantasy with no meaningful tension, two-dimensional characters, horrible world building, and very weird treatment of 12-year-old girls. It's bad, and we're going to dive into all of that in a bit, but I do kind of want to open by saying I sort of like this show. Not in the sense that it's any good, but it's the kind of thing that's just tantalizing to tear into. It's the kind of bad story that doesn't necessarily come from a lack of talent, but rather as a result of a series of recurring flaws on the part of the author, which have their thumbprints on every corner of the work. In a strange way, it kind of wraps back around to being good art in the sense that it's able to capture a very genuine humanity. I'm sure the person who wrote this was lovely and is capable of much more than what he created here. I'm not going to psychoanalyze some guy in Japan I know nothing about, but if we go with Death of the Author, this anime on its own merits has a very distinct and vibrant personality. A really obnoxious personality that makes you want to punch it in the face. I'm going to struggle to get this video out on time most likely because I just have that much to say about this absolute trash fire. And honestly, if I just gave my thoughts as we moved through the story, the synopsis would be incomprehensible due to just how fractured it would be. So I'm going to start this with a very straightforward recap of everything that happens in the first 3 episodes without commentary, and from there I'll get into the autopsy. The story starts with Gaius, an expert mage. Now in the story's universe, everyone is born with one of 4 crests, each of which is basically a prepackaged stat spread that determines what kind of magic you're best at. One is great for creating things, another for range attacks, and so on. The 4th is the strongest, and so Gaius, realizing he can't grow any stronger than he is, dies and reincarnates using magic for the sake of hopefully getting a body with the 4th crest. His new incarnation is Matthias Hildesheimer, Matty for short, and he's born into a time where the 4th crest is considered the weakest. At the ripe age of 12, he travels to the capital city to enter a school for magic, decimating a monster on his way over. Once he's in the city, he stumbles on a girl that is in need. A girl his age, named Alma, is pleading with a blacksmith to make an enchanted sword for her friend Luri, who broke hers saving Alma. If Luri doesn't have her sword, then she won't pass the entrance exam of the school Matty is also trying to get into. After forming a mutual trust with Luri, immediately after seeing her, he enchants a sword to make it super sharp and lets her have it. The 3 of them go to the entrance exams where Matty just cleans house, even schooling the top fighter among the teachers. He has an internal monologue about how everyone is using incanted magic instead of wordless magic. Incanted magic, as the name implies, uses incantations, while wordless magic does not. Wordless magic is, in this world, superior in just about every way except that incanted magic is much easier to learn. Relying on it, though, is a handicap moving forward. The 3 of them pass and get their uniforms, and Matty and Luri have a moment, which will continue to happen throughout the story. Then they get a jarringly short speech from the headmaster inducting them into the school, which characterizes him as straightforward, blunt, and willing to skirt tradition for the sake of what he believes is right. Matty gets called to the headmaster's office, and though he's worried about getting in trouble for having destroyed the training ground during the exam, he actually was brought in so the headmaster could enlist his help. See, this academy is the 2nd academy. The 1st academy, its sister school, is more prestigious and sets the curriculum, which does not include wordless magic. The magic academic literature from that school, as well, only covers incanted magic. The headmaster wants Matty to teach everyone at the school, including the teachers, wordless magic. He also wants Matty to, at the incoming inter-school competition, use wordless magic to prove that it's worth something. Matty teaches everyone wordless magic, essentially being promoted to teacher, with Luri and Alma getting the hang of it pretty quickly. They go to the tournament where he, on his own, faces off against 3 people. 2 of them are instantly dispatched. The other is a chosen, which are people who have absurdly high magical capabilities that only seem to be a part of the 1st school. In reality, they are demons in disguise. It turns out that the reason the 4th crest and wordless magic became known as useless during the time Gaius was waiting to be reincarnated into Matthias was because demons infiltrated places of authority within society and started meddling. He dispatches the demon handily. That's the end of episode 1. Episode 2 starts with the king offering Matthias a reward for slaying the demon. He considers offering a fief, which Matty does not want because it would be a hassle to manage, and they eventually settle on Matty receiving an enchanted sword that he made earlier in the story off-screen, and giving Matty free access to the dungeons in the kingdom. Not like the prisons, but as in video game dungeons. The king mentions that 4 chosen have disappeared in the wake of recent events, likely demons themselves. He asks Matty if this means the threat is gone, but Matty says no, it means they've been driven into a corner and will likely do drastic things. He guesses it'll take 3 months for them to muster their forces for a full-on invasion, and in preparation he suggests erecting a magical barrier, a task which he is put entirely in charge of. They let him take whatever he wants from their stores of magic items. He takes a magical sword that he made in a past life which he intends to break down for parts, and a magical pendant, also made by him, which increases the rate at which people get experience points. Once again, like a video game. Maddie forms an adventuring party with Alma and Luri, naturally, and takes them into a dungeon where he starts teaching them and letting them practice on weak enemies. He teaches Alma how to imbue arrows with magic and teaches Luri how to enchant weapons. Maddie takes them to a lower floor where they test their skills they just learned against some enemies, and the two of them succeed. They then make a camp, and while the two of them rest, Matthias goes to the bottom floor to fight the dungeon boss. You know, a boss, like in a video game. He wins after being forced to bring out a new strategy, which basically just amounts to using up a consumable to hit harder. Two demons notice a strong magic source somewhere in the vicinity while Maddie pulls this off. Episode 3 has them return to town, where Maddie is assumed to be a porter due to having the fourth crest. He then brings back the remains of a super powerful monster to sell, freaking everyone out. He also got stuff from the boss, which he kept in order to build the barrier. On their way back to the academy, two demons show up, and Matthias decides going to get help would be too risky, and they needed to be stopped here. He goes after the strongest, while the other two go after the weakest. Despite seemingly being weaker than the demon, Matthias is always 2 steps ahead of his opponent. The fight mostly consists of the demon doing something and it instantly being countered. Between these I knew you'd do that anime shenanigans, superior swordplay, and some powers that were heretofore unrevealed to the audience, Matthias takes out the demon. Meanwhile, Alma and Luri use kiting strategies to keep theirs busy. Eventually Matthias goes in to kill Steel, though he does enlist their help in his final attack. They fly off to escape the crowd that gathered. The king offers them more rewards. Maddie asks for more dungeons, while the girls ask for money. Matthias catches that a demon is watching them with a surveillance spell and gives them a magical shot from long distance. This whole interaction lets Maddie pinpoint its exact location, so the trio, all of whom are 12, are sent to go deal with the demons without adult supervision. It's a really long way away, but Maddie leads everyone to a dragon named Iris, who's Maddie's ally from his past life. After convincing her it's him, she agrees to give them all a ride. Alright, those are the first 3 episodes, so what was any of that? So I want to get this one out of the way first because it's probably the thing on most people's minds, and it looms over the rest of this analysis because being a Mary Sue story is a centralizing problem. It's not something which adds more problems onto an already unremarkable property, it is a fundamental flaw from which almost all other flaws are derivatives. I chose my wording very carefully there. I don't like talking about characters as Mary Sues because historically that's caused the term to be overused and misused. To the layman, a Mary Sue is an overly perfect character, often a self-insert, who harms the story around them by nature of not having flaws, and getting everything without it being earned. This is at best an incomplete understanding. The term comes from the fanfiction community, named after the protagonist of a Star Trek fanfiction which existed to parody horrible, self-indulgent fanfiction with overly perfect self-insert protagonists, which every canonical character had an unreasonably high opinion of and who centralized the story around themselves. But the tropes the fic was parodying go well beyond a poorly conceived protagonist. Perfect protagonists don't have to be a bad thing. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess has Link as its protagonist, who is very much a character in the game, even if most of his arc is told through implication. He doesn't have flaws, and everyone considers him an epic, cool guy hero, but it doesn't really cheapen the story because the story was designed around that. It was a story of an imperfect world with innocent victims being put into its proper place by a hero who represents virtues. Virtues which were lacking in the leaders and villains who got the world into the sorry state it needed saving from. It's a story with a clear tension and release of that tension, whose pathos is grounded in simple but well-established themes, for which a protagonist that everyone praises is actually a pretty good vehicle. In The Strongest Sage, however, we have a different situation. At the start of episode 2, Matthias has a conversation with the king in which he demonstrates himself to know more than the king, to be wiser than the king, and to think ahead much better than the king. Now, being a king in this world is shown to be a somewhat demanding position. His role in government procedure seems to not just be symbolic, but administrative. It would be important for him to be on top of things, but he really isn't. He comes to the incredibly stupid conclusion that now that the demons ran away, they have nothing to worry about, and then Matthias corrects him with the obvious rebuttal that they're probably planning to come back. The king being dumb wasn't a plot point, because nothing within the narrative language of the story implies that the king not coming to this conclusion was a problem. There is no tension raised over the fact that the man in charge isn't qualified for his job. He doesn't specifically plan to take counterproductive action as a result of his bad conclusion, which would have given a sense of urgency. It's not played for humor, it's not played for tension, it's not really played for anything. The king being dumb solely exists to make Matthias look smarter, not to give him a problem which he can overcome by being smarter than the king, just to be smarter than the king. A Mary Sue story is not a story with bad execution of its important bits. It lacks the important bits altogether. The protagonist's coolness isn't something the story fails to earn, it's something that the story never attempts to earn. The result of how this is written is not just a scene with no tension and an obnoxious lionization of the protagonist, but a story where the concept of a king means nothing. The king is neither a worthy figure who exists all on his own, nor is he someone who's unworthy of his position. Either one of those would give the concept of someone being a king some amount of weight, but we don't get that. This goes for everything. The villains, the teachers, all of the institutions, these groups don't really consist of people who have meaning outside of their relationship with the protagonist. If Matthias didn't go to the school, we wouldn't have anyone proactively trying to solve the problems Matthias ends up solving. We wouldn't have free thinkers, and we wouldn't have anyone achieving anything noteworthy. The result is not just a story with bad world building, but a story that, in an odd way, doesn't seem to have any. Yes, there are details about what things are called and what some things do and what things there are, but it's all, to use a metaphor, green-screened in. In the same way that no attempt at earning his coolness was made, no attempt is made to contextualize his coolness. It is its own context, which is a philosophy of writing which can only come from an author being blinded by their own obsession with their self-insert. So one thing I kind of made a point of drawing attention to is how episode 2 just blindsides you with video game mechanics out of nowhere. Honestly, that's not even a huge problem. It's a bit clunky, but we're here to have fun, and video game mechanics are fun. As a huge fan of Kumo Desu ga Nanika, I am very familiar with how game mechanics can be used in a way that is very effective. Quite frankly, they're kind of a shoo-in. Like, okay, game mechanics are a means of storytelling in their own way, but they're meant to be flexible. If you have an upgrade tree in a video game, it should be satisfying, and have a feeling of escalation and reward, regardless of what path you take down that tree. The process of speccing into a specific build, dealing with the ensuing weaknesses, and then succeeding due to the strengths of the chosen build, stuff like that is just good storytelling. And the nice thing is, you don't even really need to know how to tell a story that well, you just need to put the video game mechanics into the story and let the gears turn. We actually see this happening. The single best part of any of these episodes, by leaps and bounds, is the section of episode 2 where Alma and Luri learn how to specialize in certain types of magic and then use that to defeat progressively powerful enemies. You have setup, where you learn the outline of what powers they will have access to, the looming threat of a practical test of their skills, and then a progressively difficult series of quick trials. It was unironically good. This is the exception rather than the rule, however. Matthias constantly pulls new abilities out of his ass, and more importantly, we generally don't do much with anything after we learn about it. Actually, it's a bit deeper than that. We don't really learn much. Not much we can make sense of, at least. So much of the story ostensibly focuses on these 4 crests you can have. We get a loose understanding of what 3 of them are like in the opening narration. They're essentially pre-packaged stat spreads showing what kind of magic you're best at, but are there 4 types of magic, one for each crest? Are there more than that? Are there types of magic which don't rely on your crest? One of the crests is great for ranged attacks, but do the rest of them just suck at ranged? Or is there a 4-tier ranking system for each of the crests? I'm not asking for a giant info dump. I'm not even asking to know specifics, but whenever a crest shows up or someone casts a specific type of spell, you don't really have too much context for how you're supposed to feel about it. Like when Matthias interfered with the clairvoyant spell, was that a 4th crest thing to do? When he made those orbs which could take control of other spells, would they have been stronger if he had a different crest? Is that even something I'm supposed to be thinking about? I don't know what to be impressed by. I don't know when to feel tension. I don't know what questions to ask about a new type of magic when I see it introduced. All I can do is wait for Maddie to win. If there were just 8 elements and every spell was from one of those elements and there was a crest for each of those elements, and I saw someone using darkness magic to see things incredibly far away somehow and that person had a darkness crest, I'd be like, oh, that's something that character is good at. And if someone with a light crest showed up, I'd be like, oh, we have an answer for the clairvoyant guy. I'd have some intuitive sense of this, even if you barely explained it. What's baffling is that the way you'd get this intuitive sense is just by having these mechanics be used, but they don't really get used. Everyone at the entrance exam is casting the same firebolt spell, regardless of their crest. Everyone talks down on the 4th crest, but never gives a reason for why it's bad, nor do they talk about the others in any specific terms. Outside of the few spells which get taught to Alma and Luri, we don't really learn about spells in terms of belonging to certain categories or being best with specific crests. Maddie just does whatever crazy stuff he wants half the time, and it's rarely, if ever, grounded in any kind of systematized framework for us to try and get a feel for. Even garbage isekais tend to at least do their video game mechanics slightly competently, but the show somehow manages to bloviate about its magic system so much without ever actually feeling like the magic system has fleshed out the world or done much to contextualize fight scenes. So, this show has a very weird relationship with females. It does that age-old anime framing of society where ostensibly there aren't really any social pressures preventing women from engaging in the same adventurous career path that the men do, but everything else about how they're framed is very conservative, and there aren't many in positions of power. The fact that Matthias, who has all of his memories of being an adult, is forming a genuine crush on a 12-year-old girl is weird. Like, in layered ways. Take any otome isekai where the protagonist is an adult who gets transmigrated into the body of a character from a book they read, and they start off life as a young child. Oftentimes they'll also run into their love interest at this point. This is weird, but you generally get a sense it's incidental. They'll usually skip through early childhood fairly quickly, or not have romance start till they're both adults, or they'll even just choose to draw as little attention to them having the memories of an adult as possible. My Secretly Hot Husband, a story about a power couple who meet when they're 10 and 12 respectively, pretty much does all three on top of having her memories be framed as hazy dreams of a past life. The thing with The Strongest Sage is that the opposite almost happens. Matthias is written to come off as an adult. Adults are the main people we see him interacting with outside his two friends' physical age, both of whom have a distinctive mentor-pupil relationship with him. He is wise and traveled, specifically framed as being in a position of power over everyone around him by virtue of him being that much better than them. And in the middle of this you have Luri, a child who forms a crush on him, and he's shown as just as innocently forming a crush on her. The things this says about romance are horrifying, and they're also not unintentional. If Maddie was written like a 12-year-old, then it would just be some unfortunate implications, but the power dynamic, which results from his vastly different level of life experience, is glorified and framed as romantic. Luri and Alma are both decidedly children, people who don't understand the world and that are still making their way through the process not of self-discovery, but of self-invention. Pure, undefiled blank slates onto which the subject, Matthias, can enact his will. The life they had before this might as well not exist. They aren't defined by their motivations or stories, but instead by Matthias and how he treats them. They are clay in his hands, a relationship framed as so natural it need not be dwelled on. No questions are raised about their relationship, they simply attach themselves to this pseudo-adult figure and follow his precise will, not out of obligation or authority, but because they just feel it's the right thing to do. This is why Matthias can be framed as having this innocent crush on Luri despite being an adult in a child's body, because this relationship of authority is framed as being as casual and properly balanced as two people sitting next to each other in math class. Through this relationship, Alma and Luri become the worst part of the show, in spite of also being responsible for the best part. Matthias is surrounded by a world which doesn't yet acknowledge him. There is some dramatic tension inherent in him having to prove himself, of having to interact with people whose opinion on him vary. A story surrounding him could be slightly salvageable. However, he is constantly surrounded by two yes-men, people who exist to sing his praises, to be permanently in need of his guidance and care, constant sources of affirmation from which he is never separated. Anytime the focus is on them, it's token, a spotlight soon to be stolen by the only character who actually matters after they've demonstrated their skills just enough to show off the fruits of Maddie's instruction. Because they're not really meant to be characters, they are accessories to Matthias, means of constantly reinforcing how cool he is and to play to a fantasy. The fantasy of constantly having women adoring you, women untainted by social degeneracies or pesky priorities of their own, instead revolving wholly around you and your actions towards them. They act as an echo chamber to make sure Shikakamon is as homogeneous and repetitive as possible. The author was so concerned with his prepubescent, demure tradwife fantasy that he forgot to write characters, because that's how it always goes with these stories that have incredibly regressive views on women. A view of women like this prevents you from writing one as a compelling character, leaving only the possibility for them to be a token tag-along love interest or something equally vapid. And yet, the same worldview strongly compels you to surround your protagonist with girls. To close this off, I want to talk about themes, or more importantly, the lack thereof. The story has a certain vacant feeling to it, and the reason for that is there isn't much higher-order storytelling going on. There aren't many moments that pay off something that happened much earlier in the story, there aren't recurring motifs or very many ongoing arcs. Normally a story would have some sort of thematic message to the things that happened in it, which could give a sense of cohesion, When the second major arc is wrapping up, the thematic similarities to the first arc remind you of it and make you draw connections and generally gets you more engaged. In Strongest Sage, there really isn't anything like that, but that feels like kind of an obnoxious point. I'm not bringing it up because I think it's super interesting that it's bad at this. Most bad stories are. But I think it'd be fun to death of the author this story and try to contort this story into some sort of coherent thematic framework. The story is about the degradation of society in the absence of truly great men, Ubermensch, and how it has been corrupted from within, especially within academic institutions. Foreign invaders, which must be expelled, are seeking to make us weak. They make us forget tradition and adopt new ways which leave us vulnerable. And we are in need of a strong man who respects the ways of the past to guide us back into a golden age. To those who are savvy to politics, you'd recognize what I just described as proto-fascist, if not just fascism, directly paralleling the conspiracy theories and prejudices which led to fascist movements like the Nazis. Am I saying that the author supports fascism? Absolutely not. This is a huge stretch and more likely a coincidence than a deliberate dog whistle. What I am saying is that it's really, really funny that the main character's last name is Hildesheimer.